everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar tonight, Push to the Limit, How the Pandemic is Impacting Working Moms. My name is Victoria Brewick, and I am Pandemic Parenting's digital content producer. I would like to thank our sponsor for this webinar. Larson LLP is a national trial boutique based in Los Angeles that litigates and tries complex commercial and white-collar cases, regulatory matters, appeals, and international disputes. With a team of some of the most experienced and respected trial lawyers in the country, the firm focuses on high-stakes cases and achieves optimal results for each client before, at, and after trial. In 2020, Larson LLP was recognized as one of LA's top firms to work for by Los Angeles Business Journal, based on the firm's efforts to create a positive and supportive environment for attorneys and staff. Thank you for sponsoring us tonight. With that, I want to introduce you to our co-founders of Pandemic Parenting. Dr. Amanda Zelahusky is a clinical and forensic psychologist and an associate professor of psychology at Valparaiso University. And Dr. Lindsay Malloy, who is a developmental and forensic psychologist and an associate professor at Ontario Tech University. With that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
All right, thanks, Victoria. So welcome tonight. We're really happy to have you here. We're happy to have our amazing guests that I'll introduce in a second. But first, just why we wanted to have this conversation. I'm not going to spend very long on that because, you know, we're working moms. We have been dealing with this now coming up on a year. We know lots of other working moms, right? And a pretty clear picture is emerging from the headlines, from the academic research. And the pandemic is not good for anyone, obviously, but certainly not for mothers. So we know that moms are bearing the brunt of this pandemic in many ways, especially moms of color. So we really wanted to shine a spotlight on that tonight and talk not just about how bad things are, but also hopefully talk about why and some solutions to what we might be able to do about it. So I want to introduce you, get right into it right away, to our guests tonight. So we have with us Dr. Amy Knopf. She's an assistant professor at Indiana University and co-principal investigator of the Pandemic Parenting Study, which examines the challenges and experiences of a cohort of Indiana mothers as they navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. So welcome to her. We also have Dr. Jessica Calarco. She's an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University. Her work focuses on inequalities in education and family life, including how the pandemic is contributing to conflicts between mothers and their partners, and also undermining mothers' mental health and well-being. Okay, so our moderator for tonight, we always try to kind of highlight an emerging scholar in the field and bring them on to moderate the session. So I'm really excited to introduce you to Dr. Kendra Cleveland. She is a Doris Duke Fellow and Membership Chair of the Executive Committee for the Child Wellbeing Research Network, and she's a research scientist at UCLA. Her research concerns children and families and how best to improve relations between courts and families through translational research, policy, and practice. So welcome, Kendra, and I'm going to turn it over to you now to get started on this conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Lindsay. It's really great to be here tonight. I am also a mother of a 9-year-old son who is kind of in this Zoom school world right now. So I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation tonight. So to begin, for our panelists, can each of you start off by briefly sharing a bit about the work that you do and how it relates to the impact of the pandemic on working moms? And perhaps Amy, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks so much. So I'm Amy Knopf. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University School of Nursing. So my background is in nursing. I'm a registered nurse with also a background in public health. And I work a lot with really marginalized communities with sexual and gender minority adolescents and young people, as well as community of color on infectious disease prevention. And I got really interested in working with Jess on this project, thinking about issues around mistrust of public institutions and how people are getting information about the pandemic, and what the overall political climate and history of racism and medical abuse, what sort of effects those may have on the ways that people are responding to the pandemic and how they're taking steps to mitigate risks.
Oh, thanks, Amy, and thank you all for inviting us to be part of this conversation tonight. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to share some of this research that we're working on, and also chat with moms who are certainly dealing with the same things that we're finding in our research firsthand. I'm Jess Calarco. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University, and as Lindsay was mentioning, most of my research focuses on inequalities in education and family life. And so I had started back in 2018 a project that was looking at kind of following women from pregnancy through the first 2 years postpartum, trying to understand how do parents make decisions around sort of fraught topics in parenting, things like breastfeeding and vaccines and co-sleeping and going back to work after childbirth, and especially what role do social networks play in sort of influencing parents' decisions, and what kinds of constraints do parents face in trying to make those decisions, and what happens if you aren't able to be the kind of parent that you want to be because of the circumstances that you're facing in the moment. And so we were still so that started in 2018, and we were still in the field checking in with these same 250 moms from Indiana when the pandemic hit. So they were all somewhere between 6 months and 18 months postpartum at the time. And certainly, and some of them, about half, had older kids as well. And it was very clear very early on. We kind of transitioned quickly from doing mostly in-person interviews and surveys or online surveys, but mostly in-person interviews to online interviews, and just that the stories that moms were telling us in those early weeks of the pandemic made it clear that more research needed to be done to really understand the full impact that this pandemic was having on mothers here in Indiana. And so I started working with Amy, who has been incredibly gracious with her knowledge of kind of how public health works and kind of how people make decisions in the wake of public health risks and decision making, to kind of put together some more detailed surveys, not just asking mothers about the challenges that they were facing, but also about the kinds of decisions that they're making, as well, especially around public health risks, and thinking about, we've kind of done some work tying together parenting with public health in ways that moms are often the ones who are disproportionately responsible for making those kinds of health decisions for their families, and looking at some of the toll that that takes, especially when mothers, for example, disagree with their partners about how to best manage the pandemic and the risks that it entails. And so we've been kind of continuing that research. We just started, we're kind of in the middle of now a second round of interviews with the moms that we interviewed at the beginning of the pandemic, and some surveys with those moms and their partners as well. And then I've also been conducting some surveys kind of across the country of moms, just to see kind of, is what we're finding in Indiana consistent with what we see from a broader perspective, where we can look at mothers, especially kind of understanding more nuanced differences in terms of mothers from different racial and ethnic groups, mothers from a wider range of social class backgrounds and political backgrounds, as well, when it comes to the kinds of decisions that we're seeing during the pandemic.
Well, our very first webinar that we did, we spent a lot of time talking about decision fatigue. And I'm guessing participants probably don't necessarily call it decision fatigue, but I'm just curious about those themes coming up of just how exhausting the list is of decisions that have to be made on a daily basis, some really big and some, tiny, like what to make for dinner that night, but it just all feels like a little bit too much sometimes.
Both what Jess and Amy just said, also how we've noticed in the triaging that a lot of moms are having to do with making these decisions, which don't feel like they have clear answers for all the reasons you said, right? Decisions about health for our family. What should I do? What is safe? What isn't? We've also lost a lot of the pleasurable decision making, right? Where are we going to go for spring break? What should we do this weekend for fun? So all this decision making that we're doing, I'm so interested to think about, or to hear about, what you're finding in the research too, as far as the weight of these decisions that moms especially are having to make right now.
Yeah, I can chat a little bit about that if that's helpful. I mean, so one of the things that we find is that certainly not all couples, but especially if we're talking about different gender couples, and especially if we're talking about couples where they might have political differences on it, where especially mom is a little bit more liberal leaning and dad is a little bit more conservative leaning, in those couples, we do find that there are disagreements about how to manage risks during the pandemic. And we find that many moms, what that means, the way that they handle those disagreements to try to avoid conflict with their partners during an already very fraught time, is to take on even more of the mental load of managing risks themselves, that becomes a way to avoid conflicts. It's sort of agreeing to disagree, but agreeing to disagree when mom is the one who's taking the more risk averse position. If she's the one who thinks mask wearing is important, and she's the one who thinks that hand washing is important, and that social distancing and kind of canceling and rescheduling things is important, then she's going to disproportionately take on even more of that labor than her partner will, as a way to avoid sort of the conflicts that they might otherwise experience if they try to agree on everything, or kind of push her to. The other thing that we find happens in those cases is if the other alternative for moms that doesn't involve taking on more of the work is often deferring to their partner's position. And so essentially that means mothers dismissing their own concerns about the virus and about the pandemic. And so I think that's a tough trade-off for many moms, is sort of taking on more work or kind of being kind of gaslit in their concerns and feeling like they're not being heard, and ultimately kind of questioning their own decisions about the vaccine or about the pandemic and also vaccines.
Right. And thinking about it from that perspective, why do you all think the pandemic has been so devastating for working mothers in particular?
I think there's a number of things, and I think a focus on this idea of the mental load is really important, because I think a lot of women, keep this running list of things right in the head, like, and especially if you're a mom and you're more concerned about pandemic risks, then adding to all of the questions around um, risk and infection prevention, then you also have all these other decisions that we've been talking with women about, like, do you send your child to school or not? Do you even have the option to send them to school or not? Does your school offer online learning? Is there a choice? Do you have a choice to miss work? And there are so many decisions that are happening right now, and especially for working moms. And what we're seeing too, I think, and we may get into this a little bit more later, but when we think about mothers of color in particular, they're being disproportionately impacted, either having to leave the workforce due to childcare issues and sort of some of the segments of the economy that these women of color work in, or they are being let go from jobs because of the types of jobs that women of color often work in. And so I think the burden here for working women, we really can't underemphasize the burden for women of color. And working women right now, those women who are able to work from home are suddenly, we're enmeshed in both home and work. And I think there was a question from someone ahead of time about how do we create boundaries, or how do we have a balance between work and home? And I thought about it, and I don't think my answer is very popular, but I think we just can't expect to have those boundaries, and we can't expect to have that kind of balance. I feel like we're being, as mothers and as women, being told a lie that we can actually have those things, that we can be at home, have our job, maintain our full-time job, and put our children, on Zoom and manage all of those things, manage, all the other pandemic contexts. And I think that is one of the things that's been so hard for working mothers, whether they're losing their jobs or struggling to find childcare, or they're able to be at home, but they're trying to manage children at home. The ask is just way too big, and there's no way to actually do it. So if we're feeling overwhelmed and we're feeling like we don't have a balance and a boundary, it's because we are overwhelmed and we don't have balance and we don't have boundaries. And so I think that that's one of the hardest pieces, is that sort of blur between the line between family and work.
We've seen this quote a lot, or I've seen it a lot on social media, right? You're not working from home, you're living at work. And so, yeah, I think trying to draw that line, and what is work-life balance anymore when it's all, I think you use the word enmeshed. That's a great word for it. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And Jessica, what are your thoughts on that in terms of balance and boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Amy was saying, I think it simply just doesn't exist right now. That the idea of finding balance, and I think especially when we tell women that they should be striving for balance, or that they should be striving for finding boundaries or setting boundaries, it arguably sets women up to fail, in the sense that really these are structural problems that are far bigger than any individual. And when we tell women that they can just self-help book their way through it or bootstrap their way through it, that ignores the huge and deeply unequal, in many cases, challenges. There might be some women who have the resources to and have the support from their networks or from other people in their lives to take a mental health day, or to kind of get the extra help that they need to be able to make it through right now. But that's not the case for so many people who have lost jobs during the pandemic, who don't have access to extra resources, who are parenting without support, who are kind of dealing with all kinds of traumas, who have lost loved ones, or who are dealing with other kinds of stresses in their lives. And so I think it's really unrealistic to tell women that they should be striving for balance, and adds to the huge amounts of guilt that mothers are already experiencing. I mentioned before this survey that I ran back in December, and the numbers were just staggering in terms of, and this isn't even just mothers who are working mothers. This is all moms with kids under 18, and 91% reported that they're more tired than they were before the pandemic. 40% said they're more depressed than they were before the pandemic. 43% more anxious and nervous. 42% more easily annoyed and irritated. About a third saying they feel more guilt than they did before the pandemic. About a third saying they're having trouble concentrating on things. I mean, these are huge numbers of women reporting huge challenges with respect to their mental health and well-being. And it's, I mean, and it's, I mean, one of the interesting things is, at least in those survey data, there aren't substantial differences across mothers by socioeconomic status or by race and ethnicity, at least in terms of those kinds of mental health measures. The biggest predictor seems to be having a young child at home. Moms with young children are doing substantially worse than moms with older kids on pretty much all of those measures. But really, I think it speaks to the fact that there are such a huge range of different challenges that families are facing in the wake of the pandemic, that we're seeing just the challenges of either working from home while also providing care for your kids, or the challenges of losing a job and then having to deal with the kind of loss of income, while potentially also having more time to spend with your kids. And so there's huge trade-offs on all of these fronts that seem to be creating a really complicated set of challenges for so many women. And my hope, at least, is that women will take this opportunity to turn the guilt that they would normally feel in this kind of situation into rage instead, and really say that we can be directing our frustrations outwardly, and saying that we deserve better. We deserve compensation for the unpaid and underpaid labor that is done by women in this country, and especially by women of color and low-income women who do an outsized share of that kind of labor for our society. And think about, how can we push for policies that better support women kind of across the spectrum, and especially those who are kind of most marginalized, and have given the least opportunities and the least support in a time when they need it the most.
Oh, I have so many responses. I first just want to jump up and
Yeah.
down, Jess. Thank you, guys. Yes, to all of it. But I mean, one thing that came to mind was, I appreciated you sharing those results too, about parents with younger kids. My study found the exact same, that there was a really significant difference between parents of younger kids, like infancy through, fifth grade-ish, versus parents with older kids. The challenges are different, but just the level of supervision needed and what's expected, I mean, huge differences. So it was helpful to hear that was consistent with what you found. But I was also just sort of thinking about, like Lindsay, you abhor the term self-care, right? You wrote a whole blog about it. And so, why is that as a working mom? Why do you hate it so much?
Well, it just, as you were talking, I was thinking about, we had Dr. Travis Heath on when we talked about anti-racist parenting. And in his TED Talk, he talks about the story of a woman. Anyway, there's this quote in there, which hopefully I get right, which is something like, we're asking her to self-care her way out of a social inequity. And I was like wanting to jump out of my chair in that. And it just kind of reminds me of, what you just said reminds me of that like we can't self-care our way out of this, even if we have time for a bubble bath or, whatever. It's not really going to do the trick in this circumstance. And so I think, I really appreciated that. And I wonder, so how, and thinking about, your quote, which I think was in the New York Times, but that also made me want to jump out of my chair. Like the other countries have social safety nets, the US has women. I mean, can we talk about that a little bit and maybe like link it with, well, what can we do? Because I mean, I'm in Canada. I would say, yes, Canada has more of a social safety net, but things are definitely still not great here either for working moms, especially right now. Like they're also bearing the brunt of it here. So I would love to just talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that quote comes from, I mean, I was reflecting at the time on kind of our history of social policy in the US, and where the differences between the US and especially sort of many sort of Scandinavian countries and Western European countries comes from. And really it stems from World War II. And essentially in the wake of World War II, during World War II, many women entered the workforce in countries that were participating in battle, because women were needed at home to hold the jobs that men would typically hold while they were off fighting in wars, or in many cases joined the war effort, especially in medicine and other kinds of related fields. Now, when the war ended, most of Europe had suffered kind of substantial physical destruction, and had plenty of jobs to go around for the men who did survive and were returning from battle and needed kind of jobs to physically rebuild society. And they needed women to continue working in order to kind of fill the jobs that they had filled during the wartime effort, as well. And so what that meant was that in order to keep women working for the long term, many European countries invested in strong social safety net programs and things like um, in things like paid maternity leave and in things like affordable childcare, that those systems really came out of the wake of World War II. In the US, meanwhile, we didn't suffer the same physical destruction that other countries did. And so instead, there was this rhetorical push to tell women that it was their patriotic duty to go back home, to leave their jobs, to abandon the workforce, especially sort of middle and upper middle class white women. And so what that meant, and then those were the women that created the 1950s, that created this idea of the sort of idealized family structure where we have um, kind of mom staying home and dad going to work, that came out of this policy push in the wake of World War II to really prioritize men's jobs, and especially kind of middle and upper middle class white men's jobs in the wake of the war. And so I think what that gets at, and that's kind of the history of social policy that's driven us forward in the decades since then, that has kind of guided our decisions, this idealized version of, especially for white women, mom at home and dad at work, and for women of color, especially doing jobs that men don't want to do, especially jobs in sort of the care economy, and kind of how that pushes, especially women of color and low income women that have to work into kind of jobs that are sort of deeply undervalued by society, while also kind of creating these pressures for especially white women to stay home with their children instead. And so that kind of creates um, this sort of system where that if that's the ideal, then there's very little policy pressure to try to actively support women working, and especially to work in jobs that are adequately compensated for the value of the labor that they provide to society as a whole.
Absolutely. And, I'm seeing a lot come through on the chat. Like, we hear you, we're with you, we understand these challenges, but we also want to talk about solutions. And so, Amy, perhaps first I'll direct this question to you. What are some things that employers can consider in terms of supporting working parents? There are managers and people in leadership roles attending tonight wondering what they can do to support their staff.
Yeah, so at IU, we've been really fortunate. Our university had a policy, I think it was in mid-March through the end of June to July 1, where basically if you couldn't attend work, that was acceptable. And those who did attend and who had sort of essential service jobs were paid more to show up and be present at work. And I mean, for me, that was one of the most remarkable programs, and I think it was pretty unique within the academic community. But it's not realistic for a lot of employers, and I think the things that we need are difficult for one individual employer to provide. Women, particularly mothers, they need childcare. We need help on days off. And I know, for example, at our school, at our university, there was a program intended to help especially junior faculty, women and mothers, but we had to fill out this very long application to get any sort of assistance. And a couple of colleagues and I, we opened it and we forget it. In the time it takes us to fill this out, we could probably come up with some other solution to this. But I think some of it is around flexibility and about decreased expectations. But one thing that I'm finding troubling is this idea of decreased expectations or reduced workload. Again, I'm just drawing a little bit from my own experience, but for example, we've been allowed to delay going up for promotion and tenure. Well, on the face of it, this sort of lowered expectation sounds potentially helpful. However, in the end, when we delay promotion and tenure, or when other women are not given opportunities to advance, or told, oh, you can wait to apply for that advancement, or you don't have to take this leadership position, what's going to end up happening is we're just going to fall farther and farther behind. And so some of the ideas that I think employers are coming up with in an attempt to be helpful actually may end up putting women at a disadvantage. And we've already seen that in the academic field within the first several months of the pandemic. Men's publishing, their rate of publishing increased substantially, whereas women's fell substantially. So the gap in the ability to be productive during the pandemic was really evident in academia, at least very early on. So the idea that we would give people less responsibility or not pressure them as much, I think we have to really watch the overall lifetime career effects of that on women, and instead maybe allow women to choose what sort of advancement opportunities they want to go for, or reduce the expectations for that advancement rather than delaying the advancement, which is what is happening at a lot of employers. So instead of saying you don't have to go up for that promotion, say, okay, we'll let you go up for that promotion with this, slightly tweaked criteria or slightly less burden of responsibility, but you still have that opportunity.
Which I think raises the idea, Lindsay and I have been thinking about this a lot too, just the unintended consequences when employers don't ask parents and instead make assumptions about what kind of flexibility they might like, or sure, we'll delay it, or, give you these opportunities to pause your, in our case, in academia, right, your tenure clock or whatever, without thinking about the unintended consequences of that, or how that gap is going to increase. Like many of our colleagues, without children for various reasons, have been producing at much greater rates than those of us who are trying to simultaneously homeschool our kids or do remote learning or manage all of the things all at once. And so I think, you just raise a great example, Amy, in thinking about and reminding employers to just think about those worst case scenarios. What are the unintended consequences of these policies that mean well and have good intention, but could actually make the problem worse and lead to even more disparity?
It's also really tough because, it puts the employee in this position of then telling you that this great idea that you came up with is actually not a great idea. And a lot of people are really reluctant to do that. So I think the extent to which managers, supervisors can work with their employees to create these programs, it would be helpful not only in the overall impact, but also not putting employees in a position where they have to later tell you that this program that you maybe invested a lot of time setting up isn't actually something that's ultimately useful to them.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Sorry, Kendra. I know you have so many great ones queued up. I just was thinking about what both Jess and Amy have been saying about the disparities. And so in thinking about the different kinds of work and contexts, that Black and brown working moms might be in. And so how any thoughts about what employers could be doing specifically as we think about this, the major inequities that this is just, making even worse, what employers could be doing to better support communities of color?
I mean, I'd say on that front, hiring more workers. Essentially, we need a larger workforce. We need employers to commit to hiring more labor. I mean, I think we are in a moment where if we want to be able to offer, especially women who are working in kind of risky positions that may come with low levels of stability and low levels of income, if we want to increase their benefits, if we want to give them more flexibility, if they have to stay home with a sick child, if they have a child who is home from school, if we want to make sure that they continue to be paid while they are staying home, then we need a larger workforce. And I think that kind of commitment to, and I think it also addresses it can create jobs for those who have been pushed out of the workforce. I think, especially if employers who have the resources to do so are able to increase their workforce to offload some of the overwork that is happening on so many folks in the wake of the pandemic. So many organizations right now have hiring freezes in place. And so what that means is that when staff members leave their jobs, and we've seen many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women leaving their jobs during the pandemic, in addition to those who have lost their jobs, what that means is that there's extra pressure on the women who are still working to do even more labor than they were before. And so I think committing to ending hiring freezes as soon as possible, hiring more workers, putting people back to work who are able to do so, and then doing so in a way that provides the flexibility that especially parents need. Yeah, thank you for that. 2.5 million. Sorry, it's late. I've been up since 5 a.m. It's a long day. I can't remember numbers at this time of the night. But yeah, and so I think that's one potential commitment on that front. I mean, I think also raising the minimum wage is a critical step forward to absolutely acknowledge the value of the labor that especially Black and Latina women do in our economy, and that is often deeply underpaid, especially things like childcare workers, who are among the lowest paid workers in our economy and who are essentially doing the work that allows so many mothers to do their own work in the economy. And so I think starting there, kind of bolstering the childcare force, increasing the minimum wage, and pushing employers to increase their labor force are some key ways to address some of the inequities that we have in the economy right now.
Absolutely. And, I love this next question, which is what can partners do? Brett in Illinois asked, how can dads help? And Kara in Ontario asked if there are any apps or tools that can help couples plan so things are more equal. So either of our panelists, if you'd like to speak to that.
I'm happy to speak to this one. I mean, I think the more that dads can do without being asked, the better.
That's why
Essentially,
I'm giggling. It's just, I mean, I want to honor that question, but it's also just points back to that mental load, the
exactly.
expectation that I can tell you what to do to help me. It's just, and it's not just dads.
Right.
It's, yeah. Coming from a two-mom family, I mean, it's just there is an assumption that one partner has the mental list and knows what needs to happen, and I feel like the most important thing would be to sit down and think about the things, and not ask someone, what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Amy said, I mean, I think there's the literally just looking around the house and figuring out like what needs to be done, what needs to be done for the kids, what needs to be done. I mean, I'm literally staring at a giant pile of laundry on my bed right now that someone could fold. I'm not folding it. I'm going to climb under it and sleep under it if no one folds it. And that's probably what I will do. But like, and so I mean, I think there's just, and like my kids could do the laundry. I mean, they're 6 and 3. They probably can't do that much laundry that effectively. But if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. And so it's those kinds of things. And so I mean, I think there's ways of, and it's easier for me to just either do it or not do it than try to explain how to do it or where it's supposed to go or how it's supposed to get put away. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, but it's also a fraught question in that sense too.
It's a very telling one. And I think too, there was another question that sort of feeds into this one. And I think I think it was a mother asked, how do I get my family to do things? We've tried a chore chart, we've tried conversations, we've tried family meetings, and they won't do anything. And I think along that same line, I'm just thinking, I mean, it depends on how old your kids are, but just sometimes the most effective thing is to stop doing them. If no one wants to help you make dinner, then just don't make it and let everyone just fend for themselves, to the extent that you can do that. I have a younger child, but she's getting old enough now that, I feel like if she's hungry enough, if she doesn't want to help me, then she's going to have to figure out something for herself. But there have been things like that where I just kind of stopped doing it and see if anyone else does it. And, eventually someone's not going to like having dirty clothes or not having things. Another thing that I've done with my own daughter is I've started, if she doesn't pick her things up or she doesn't put her toys away, then she doesn't get them the next day. Now with my kid, it doesn't matter. She's just like, well, I don't want that tomorrow anyway. So it may not work with everyone's child. Mine is not very amenable to sticks, but there are things that we can do. And I think sometimes as mothers, at least speaking for myself, like I tend to underestimate what other people are capable of and just kind of do it rather than asking, which I realize is sort of conflicting with what I just said about, not wanting people to ask. But yeah, and I can kind of see some of the chat, and I want to acknowledge that different families have lots of different things going on, and there aren't always options to not do certain things. But I think if you have a family which this particular participant who sent in the question has, where they're sitting down, they're having multiple conversations, she's asked multiple different ways. At that time, the only thing that I can think of is just to stop doing some of the things that you're asking the other family members to take on. And I feel like the implication was potentially a co-parent in the mix who's not taking on responsibility.
And I think related to that, it's also this idea of just adjusting our expectations. Like, we're still in a pandemic. This is our first pandemic. We don't know what we're doing. We're trying to figure it out as we go along. And so, if we're holding ourselves as moms, which is back to the mom guilt thing, you both talked about, if we're holding ourselves to those same standards of the working mom I was in February of 2020, that doesn't make any sense. We're not in that context anymore. And so how can we adjust our expectations in our home and of ourselves? And I just think of all the balls I've dropped this year, like for the times that my kids have been able to be in school, and just, God, we forgot it was crazy hat day, and I didn't send Valentine's when just all the things that I would usually beat myself up about. It's like, all right, you know what? They're fed, they're happy. We're okay today, and that's about where my bar is. And so, we're all doing the best we can. So if we can sort of adjust our expectations, I think that's a big piece of this.
Yeah. So whatever you do, don't post your toddler's dinner on social media. I learned that the hard way last week when I posted like a joke about my toddler's dinner, and people had a lot of thoughts on it and how I was doing as a parent because I didn't have enough sauce and enough seasoning and enough. I was like, there's like 3 healthy food options on that plate. Like, it's a pandemic. It's the end of the week. There's a lot happening. So yeah, I think that it's interesting that the judgment aspect and the mom shaming stuff is still very much alive and well, despite the fact that we are, almost a year into a pandemic where people have basically no social support and, schools and, all sorts of things. So
I think,
interesting.
Oh, sorry to speak over you, Lindsay.
No, I'm done.
One of the things that comes to mind for me, though, when I was a pretty new mother, one of my neighbors, I was talking to him about how I felt all this guilt about keeping my career and not staying home with my child, especially because I have an only child. And I was feeling so much anxiety, and he just looked at me, and I remember he was like pushing his kid on the swing. He just didn't even stop. And he was like, well, the idea of sitting at home and doing enriching activities with our child is a very new and very culturally bound idea. And, as I started thinking about that, there are people all over the world who are flourishing without Pinterest and without bento box lunches and without, special arts and crafts and Valentine's and special crazy hat days. And, I think we have this idea as a society that everything has to be Instagrammable or perfect, or that we have to do these enriching activities with our children and sit home and entertain them. And it was really helpful for me to think about like the whole history of humanity, and that you actually don't have to do those types of things and to be a good parent. You don't have to constantly entertain your child and do everything perfectly and have this sort of constant enrichment with your children in order to be a good parent.
Yeah, to Amy's point, one of the things that I found in the national survey that I ran in December was that the parents who are reporting the highest levels of frustration with their kids are actually highly educated white parents. That those are almost 50% of those parents are reporting increased frustration with their kids during the pandemic, compared to only about 20% of Black parents, and about 30% of parents, other parents of color. And so it's a huge difference. And I think that gets at the idea of which parents are feeling that pressure to constantly entertain their kids and to kind of I mean, I think certainly those are pressures that are felt by many parents, but I think that the way that kind of concerted cultivation parenting, which is kind of like a term that captures this idea of sort of high pressure intensive parenting where you're supposed to be spending all your time with your kids and entertaining your kids and negotiating with your kids, that those kinds of it can lead to unhealthy relationships, like, and especially when parents are trying to put that much pressure on their kids to be uh, perfect all the time, to kind of do all the academics and to not kind of give in to screen time challenges. I mean, I think it's creating significant conflicts in many families, and I think that gets it. And it's certainly, I mean, I think it's understandable that those increased conflicts, increased yelling, are happening in many families, because of the stresses of the pandemic. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, as Amy was saying, that these are cultural norms, that around sort of how we think about what good parenting is, and that they don't necessarily, that we can question and challenge those norms and push back against them, and that it doesn't have to be that way.
And they look different for everyone. I mean, I think that's been hard related to the mommy shaming stuff Lindsay was talking about, is that, for some family, we've talked to so many parents in our work with pandemic parenting this year, which has been amazing, right? And for some, it's been this beautiful experience of, I'm having more time with my family, and it's been awesome to get to see my kid learn how to read and be present for those things. And others are on the far other end of that continuum of, I am so overwhelmed and frustrated and I can't do all the things, and the tension in my home is unbearable right now. And so I just think it's important to honor wherever everyone is. We're all in a different place with this. And so, there's not a right or wrong way to do this. And so it's not helpful in a lot of these circles when we're shaming people for what their particular unique circumstance is, or, why don't you just do this? Or here's how you should be balancing it as a working mom. And because everybody's circumstance is different. And so there's a place for all of that.
Yeah. And I do feel that the more kind of grace and forgiveness that you can give to yourself, the more you're actually able to really extend that to your kids. I think it takes a lot of kind of cognitive load off of us thinking about ourselves and how bad we're feeling about how we may have reacted to something. And it allows us to actually give that time and space to our kids instead. We do have another question. Well, Leah in California said, as an older mom, I'm struggling to have enough energy to have quality interaction with my kids in between working, and I miss them. And so just kind of this idea of quality versus quantity of interaction and what quality can really look like. Amy, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. One thing that I've been trying to do, and I will try to think of where I read about this, but I've been trying to just take like 15 minutes to play with my child, and she gets to put my phone in phone jail, and I turn my computer off. I put everything aside and give her 15 to 20 minutes. I tell her how long it's going to be, and I just let her direct what we're going to do, which means that we play Harry Potter, and I have to be a professor, and my accent is unacceptable, and there's a whole lot of stage directing, and it's kind of miserable. But I think for her, getting that much time that I'm not focused on anything else, and I'm not doing anything except following her whims and her little dictations for 15, 20 minutes, it seems to be helping both her and me. I don't feel like I'm constantly just giving her half my attention. And I mean, to a lot of people, maybe 15 minutes sounds like a tiny amount of time, and like I'm a terrible mom that I only spend 15 minutes like that with my kid, but sometimes it's all I have. And or it's all the undivided attention I have, I should say. And that's really been helpful. And then on the weekends we do a little bit more, but I try to let her really direct what we're going to do. And sometimes she wants to make up silly games. And so that's been one thing where I feel like I actually am spending time with her.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Jessica, I'll direct this next one to you. We had a question from Rebecca in the Q&A. Even though you said there are no boundaries, how can you mentally switch from the conscientious, efficient working robot to a loving, caring, patient mom within seconds, sort of that back and forth?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's possible. I mean, I think we have to give ourselves grace that we're not going to be able to do that perfectly. I mean, I think there are going to be times when I'm in the middle of something and my kids have interrupted me for the 17th time, and I'm going to get frustrated. And I think I have to recognize that it's not a perfect circumstance, and that that's understandable, just the way that they're going to get frustrated at me, that I don't have my undivided attention to give to them. And I mean, I think it's we all I mean, I think I try to remember that my kids are frustrated and angry and sad about this situation just as much as I am, and that we're all just trying to do the best that we can given the constraints that we're under. I mean, I think and if we blow up at each other, we apologize and work through it, and say, you know what, that like I didn't handle that perfectly, and that's okay. And I try to model that for my kids, and I try to encourage them to do the same. That if they get frustrated and angry about a situation, whether it's that there's my kids at each other, if one of them steps on the other one's toy or whatever it happens to be, or if it's at us, if it's at me or my husband, then kind of modeling how they can apologize and kind of work through moments where we don't do it perfectly.
That's something that
yeah,
I've
go ahead.
really if I'm gonna like try to find some silver lining, I think for me there have been a lot of opportunities to say, I'm sorry, I really didn't handle that very well. My daughter is observing me work, and she is observing the value that I put into my career and the work that I put into my career. And I think that there's value in that too. I think we often focus on what we're not giving our children as parents, but part of what we're giving our children as working mothers is a model for working really hard and doing something that's meaningful and doing something that brings you joy sometimes, maybe not always, but is really important. And I want my daughter to see that. And if that means that I am not always a perfect mother, I'm not always right there with her for every little thing, I still know that she sees that I'm working, and she imitates and plays at working. And she always asks me when she sees me doing something like this if I'm really famous, and I like to lie and say I'm super famous, and she thinks that's great. But there is value in them seeing us struggle, and there's value in them seeing us devote our attention to things that are not them.
Gosh, I agree
You know what?
100%. Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say that I have a 3-year-old. Actually, my kids are about the same age as Jeff's kids, I think, actually. So we've probably had a lot of the same experiences. But my 3-year-old, she was telling a story, and she just kept saying, and then the mommy went to work, and then the mommy had to work all day long, and the mommy was working all day long. And I was just feeling so terrible about it. And so then I said to her, like, why was the mommy working all day long? And she looked at me and said, because she loves her work. And that was just like a really, again, not trying to make like, oh, I'm so glad I've had her home for like a year. It's not, I would rather this not be the case. But it was interesting to me that that's why she thought, I was working, because I loved it. And I liked the idea of being able to show her, a model of someone who like cares about this and is doing this, and it's something that I feel, very strongly about. And so that was kind of a nice little aspect of it.
Yeah, they're like, just as much as we're talking about these things that we get to see in their worlds that we don't always have glimpses of, in our before times lives, that they're getting to see these things in ours. My son was struggling with his geometry homework today, and I was struggling with him to help him. And then, 10 minutes later, he comes in and sees me frustrated with my work that I was trying to figure out. And it was just this great parallel experience, like you were talking about, Amy, that he also got to see like, oh, there are parts of your work you don't always know how to do, or you get frustrated, and, we figure that out. And so, yeah, I do think some of those experiences are great for them. And what you were saying about we get do-overs as parents, like, you have not traumatized your child because you snapped at them one time and said, 10 more minutes, I need 10 more minutes to do this email. We get do-overs. And I've learned in our house that it really helps when we can sort of be predictable and say, you know what, mommy's going to work until this time. And then we're going to spend those 15 minutes like you described, Amy, or then we're going to take a break and we're all going to play a game, or we're going to have dinner. But if I can predict that for them and they know that that's coming, it gives me a little bit more of a window, to kind of get some stuff done.
There was this question that really stuck with me that came in with the registrations that was from, I think, Adriana in Ontario. And she asked just simply, it was just how are we supposed to do all of this? And that's something that I've pretty much asked myself every day since this started. And in Amy, you kind of touched on this earlier, which is maybe that we're not. But I'm just wondering if Jess or Amy, if you have further thoughts on that question.
I mean, when I read that question, you could just see in the way that she typed it out. I think it was literally how, ... just how. And I think Jess and I both had sort of a similar knee-jerk reaction is there isn't an answer. We can't do all of these things. There was a question about, well, what do you mean by like turning your guilt into rage? I think someone asked Jess, like, what does that mean? And I think it gets at the answer to that question is like, we cannot, there is no how, there is no why, we can't do this. And what we're being told by these ideas of like, are there apps that we can use to get our partners to do things? Or how do we create boundaries? Or how do we have balance? Like all of those things are turning all the pressure and all the how back to women and back to mothers. When really it's like we're reaching out and we're saying, oh, we can't do this. And it's like, well, if you only did this, and so I think what we mean when we say things like turning guilt into rage or ungaslighting is another phrase that I know Jess has used before, because we are being gaslighted as mothers, being told that we should be able to do all these things. We should be able to have balance. We should have a job. We should be homeschooling our children or sending them to school in the midst of this pandemic. And so by turning it around and saying, this is not our problem, this is a societal level problem, and how do we do that? I think there were some other comments like, okay, we get it, this is a structural issue, but what do we do right now? Well, what we do right now, we vote, we make our voices heard, in politics, we make phone calls, we donate. I think one of the most important things we can do is to donate to groups that are helping women of color, who are organized and who are led by women of color, to try to counteract some of these effects of racism, not just right now in the pandemic, but more generally, and really supporting moms of color. But the problem is that we are feeling this burden and we're asking, how can we get it done? And nobody's asking us, how can we support you in getting it done? Or if they are, they're coming up with programs that, like I said, we cannot actually apply to or don't really benefit us.
Exactly, that this is a structural problem, that this is not an individual level problem. And essentially, I mean, I keep thinking back to the women that we've talked to, the women that I've interviewed during the pandemic, about when I ask them and when my grad students ask them, so why are you the one doing the bulk of the childcare and not your oftentimes man partner? They don't even talk about it. And so much of this stems from even things like the gender gap in wages, that in most couples, women earn less than their than their male partners. And so what that means is that when push comes to shove, if somebody's career has to get sacrificed, it just literally makes more sense monetarily for the woman to be the one to put her career on hold, because risking his salary puts a bigger hit to the family finances. And so many moms, especially moms of young kids, have already scaled back even pre-pandemic to working only part-time or to having more precarious types of positions. And so that just the whole system is stacked against us. And so really trying to say, how can we fix this as individuals is deeply problematic. And as Amy said, it really is more about how can we use whatever resources and whatever privilege we do have to try to push for the kinds of policies to kind of support the policymakers and the activists who are working toward promoting a better system, that especially can work for those who are most marginalized, as opposed to just continuing to try to tinker our way back to a system that was already broken and unequal to begin with.
Yeah, it's why I've been so frustrated when I've seen in the headlines, that women are opting out of the workforce. And that has made me really frustrated to see that word. Like, no, we've been given an impossible choice. I'm not opting out. I don't have a choice when I don't have childcare and I'm a single parent and I have, now have to manage this. And so it just also, I'm glad you mentioned, the notion of privilege, Jess, that for those of us, men and women who are in powerful positions, who have the ability to say, hey, in my context, I'm on the tenure and promotion committee, and there are junior colleagues who are struggling right now, who are going up for tenure, and I am in a position where I can stand up and use my position to say, this isn't okay, we need to change this policy, this doesn't make sense. And so for those of us, I think, who can also, help support other women who may not be in a position to advocate themselves for a variety of reasons, of disadvantage, of disparity, or just, yeah, I think we also have to step up for those who can't for themselves for a variety of reasons.
And I think whenever I look at the decision makers, and we know, like if we look, whether we look at politics or we look at CEOs of major companies or whatever, they're typically, look one way, right? Like there's probably not a lot of mothers of young kids in those situations, in those powerful positions. I mean, there's evidence of that, right? So when I see these policies coming down, they're not reflecting people who have kids or they had kids 30 years ago. And so they've really just kind of forgotten what this is like. And I think so getting more, so basically you have to run for office is what I'm saying. So in addition to everything else you're doing, go run for political office. And, so I'm just joking, but I do think it'd be great if we had better representation of moms in places where decisions are made on these things. So,
yeah. And we're going to take one more question from the audience. But before that, I do want to remind you to please fill out our 1-minute feedback survey before you go. Victoria has posted the link in the chat. So we did have a really interesting question come in that says, do any of you consider the sandwich generation in your research? Any tips for mothers who are also caring for parents?
We've talked to moms that we've interviewed during the pandemic, and I've also done some research just here within my university, talking to folks who are dealing with caregiving responsibilities at both ends of the spectrum, and hearing stories that certainly we know that women not only do the work of caring for young children, but are also disproportionately responsible for caring for sick and elderly family members and friends, and that work, that underpaid and highly undervalued and often unpaid work is extremely challenging, especially when you're coupling that with childcare responsibilities as well. I mean, I think it's an overlooked often form of care that is taxing. And I think we've seen discussions, I think, around things like the vaccine during the pandemic, of the complications where it is often falling to the children of elderly parents to even try to get them to have the opportunity to take the vaccine because of complicated online systems and sort of other types of challenges related to delivery. And I think it to me, it also speaks of privilege in that moment of sort of who has which elderly people have access to children who are internet savvy enough and have the time to sit there and click refresh on the web pages until they're able to get their elderly parents vaccines. And how does that then skew who has access across racial lines or across socioeconomic lines as well. But certainly I think that the demands, I've talked to so many moms that are the delivery drivers for their elderly parents. They're getting their groceries for them. They're setting up Wi-Fi. They're setting up devices so that they can talk to their grandkids. They are taking them to health appointments. They are doing all sorts of work, not only for their kids, but certainly for parents and other elderly people in their lives as well.
Right, right. And we just want to maybe ask one final question of our panelists. And Amy, I'll direct this to you first. What is one message you have right now for working moms and all of the people who care about them?
The one takeaway that I hope people have is if you feel like you're failing, you're not. We are navigating a global crisis of unprecedented proportions, and we're all trying to survive, and just surviving and getting through the day is really enough, and you're enough. And it's not that you're not doing something well. We have been set up to fail in some ways, to fail to meet the expectations that are being asked of us right now. So I just hope that people can be gentle with themselves and realize that if you feel like you're floundering, if you feel overwhelmed, it's because you should be. We are being asked to do too much, and it's not a personal failure, it's a social failure.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I think, to build on what Amy said, I think I would add that, especially for moms who are in a more privileged position, to remember when we do eventually end this pandemic, what it feels like to have your safety net, your social support system, your resources that you rely on, your routines that you depend on ripped away from you, and how quickly things can become impossible. and think about the kinds of the many women and the many people in our society that experienced that long before the pandemic, and that were already dealing with the stresses and traumas and hardships of not having stable routines, stable childcare, adequate resources, kind of adequate mental health services. I mean, I think that there's sort of all kinds of traumas that this pandemic has amplified. And so using this as a moment to reflect on not only not judging yourself in this moment, but remembering that and not judging others for the hardship that they're facing, and the challenges that creates as well.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to thank the audience for your questions tonight and for all the insights that the panelists have shared. I'm going to turn it back over now to Amanda to close us out.
All right. Thank you, Kendra. And thank you for moderating a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I'm really appreciating all of the comments in the chat and Q&A, and really have appreciated people's honesty and support of one another, because boy, do we need it. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I also want to thank Dr. Amy Knopf and Dr. Jessica Calarco for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you so generously sharing your wisdom, the results of your research. A lot of folks are asking where they can access some of the results and articles and such that you referenced. So we'll be sure to be posting those things on our resources on the website so that they can read more about the great work that you've been doing. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. Please, as Kendra mentioned, let us know what you thought about tonight's webinar. Again, the feedback survey is in the chat. And for those of you who might be watching this recording later, please follow the feedback link and let us know your thoughts. Other topics you might want us to tackle, ways we can continue to be helpful in supporting pandemic parents right now. We also want to let you know what's coming next. So things are, changing, and pandemic parenting is shifting into another phase of ways we hope to continue to be helpful. So we've got some great things planned for the weeks and months ahead. After surveying you, our pandemic parenting community, and incorporating lots of your feedback, we're going to be changing things up a bit and bringing you more resources in some new and exciting ways. So if you're not already signed up for our email list or following us on social media, we encourage you to do so. And Victoria's posting those links in the chat, which you can also find on our website. So be sure to get signed up and follow along so that you don't miss what's coming. And again, if you haven't had a chance to give us your feedback about what you think we should be doing next, what we should continue, how we should change things up, please also fill out the survey link that Victoria has posted to give us your overall feedback. Please keep sharing the website and resources with others, with parents, with caregivers, with people who work with kids. Especially today, share it with other working moms who might be able to benefit from these messages of solidarity, some possible solutions and tips and resources that were shared tonight. We have to keep supporting each other if we're going to continue to keep navigating all of this. So thank you again for being with us. And we look forward to continuing to share more, hopefully in the weeks and months to come, to continue supporting you all. And please hang in there and give yourself grace, as Amy and Jess have encouraged us tonight. Thank you, everybody.